Welcome back to the Biblical Justice Resources Podcast. As you may know, before the start of this podcast, Biblical Justice Resources existed as a website with various resource lists. But biblicaljusticeresources.com does not exist today without the influence of another resource website, lgbtchristianresources.com. Seeing what a fully fledged resource website could look like is what finally led me to move the Biblical Justice Resources lists off my personal portfolio and onto their own dedicated website. It is because of that influence that I reached out to today's guest, Joylyn Weikum. Joylyn is the founder of LGBT Christian Resources and a passionate advocate for LGBTQ+ inclusion in faith communities. Drawing from her lived experience as a lifelong Seventh-day Adventist and 7 years teaching high school at a non-denominational Christian academy, she speaks openly about the complexities of identity, spirituality, and belonging. Her work centers on offering compassionate support, affirmation, and practical tools for those navigating questions of faith and identity. Through teaching, mentoring, foster parenting, and community building, Joylyn helps others experience love beyond a doctrine and connection that fosters healing. Through our conversation, you'll learn more about the similarities in our journeys to creating resource websites, the different Christian positions regarding human sexuality and gender identity, and the ways different types of resources and interpersonal relationships can help expand your understanding of different complex topics. Now, if you will, join me for this conversation with Joylyn Weikum. My name's Eric, and this is the Biblical Justice Resources Podcast. Our conversation will begin right after this. The Biblical Justice Resources Podcast is supported by listeners like you at patreon.com/biblicaljusticeresources. If you're interested in supporting the podcast and helping to resource individuals and the church for the pursuit of biblical justice, please consider giving today at patreon.com/biblicaljusticeresources. Again, visit patreon.com/biblicaljusticeresources to help support the podcast. Now on with the show. Joylyn, thank you for joining me today. It's good to finally meet you here and get started here. I have to tell you, so the way that I found out about you, I'm pretty sure, or at least the website, is that the LGBT Christian Resource Instagram page followed my day job's Instagram page, which I am responsible for. And I had one of those like spidey sense moments where I was like, that's like what I'm doing with the Biblical Justice Resources. How I jumped into, and also as I continue rambling for a moment, finding your website. I didn't have the website for Biblical Justice Resources set up yet. It was just living as like resource lists on my personal website because I can afford exactly one website right now. And finding yours, I was like, maybe it's time to switch from having a personal profile website with some resource lists on it to having the resource list be the website and just kind of find a way to stick a personal profile on there when I need it. So thank you for that.
Absolutely.
It's been good to find your website.
For sure,
Maybe,
for sure. I think that's pretty cool that I somehow found your page because I basically, from that profile, my LGBT resources, Christian resources Instagram profile, it gives me recommendations as to like people to add and friends and profiles to add. So your page must have been there, either connected to some other pages that I followed or were following me, or it recommended. So the algorithm there helped us meet, I think.
yeah. And it probably makes sense because one of the things that my day job talks about, talks about social issues with pastors and ministry leaders. And one of those is sexuality and gender. So
Mm-hmm.
that's probably how that came to
Neat.
be. How, maybe to kind of start off here, we're going to get to like broader context for how you created the website itself, but maybe before that, what are some experiences that led you to focus on talking about or thinking about sexuality and gender?
Yeah, absolutely. I grew up and went to almost exclusively Seventh-day Adventist Christian schools and youth group and summer camps and even university. And so if you look into that d denomination, my denomination, definitely there's not like an affirming stance there. It's a non-affirming of LGBTQ. Um, like affirming theology. And so basically, it wasn't something that was talked a lot about or that I was exposed to much at all growing up. And so I really became interested in this topic and caring about this issue and these people once I became a high school teacher at a non-denominational Christian school. And so I taught high school math there actually. And I like math because it's we can stick to the facts and the formulas and all of that. Like there is a right answer to everything, and that's kind of the way that I thought about things, whether it was math or even theology or my beliefs and things like that. I like finding like what the right answer is, but the theology around homosexuality is something that I had never I had a vague idea, a non-affirming viewpoint, but when it came down to practically like engaging and being in relationship with especially young people, my students at this Christian school, I found that my students who were a little bit quirky or different, they would come and stay in my room during lunch and want to hang out with me and talk with me and really seem to trust me. And as the years progress, I realized a lot of those kids were the LGBTQ or queer kids at the school, but they were in hiding basically at the school because there was a whole atmosphere at the school of almost like a witch hunt. Like students could turn in other students that they thought might be gay, or have some kind of confusion around their gender, and then they would really have to go into some type of therapy to be addressing that to even be able to stay at the school if they wanted to stay at the school. So I started kind of observing what was happening at the school, and I didn't have a strong position as to like what would God really want in this situation. But I really felt convicted that God wants these kids in my classroom. Like God would want them here with these Christian teachers that pour into them and teach them about Jesus. And just the fact that if they have this certain identity that they might be forced out of the school, that just did not sit right with me at all. And I love these kids. And so I have many stories that I won't get into all the finer details, but there's some students that really stand out in my mind. One in particular was a student that he was not one of those kids that like loved me as a teacher and wanted to come hang out during lunch. He actually kind of caused me some trouble, but I found out later, once he went away to college, that while he was in my math classes, he was leaving school early, I think almost every week, and going to kind of a conversion therapy kind of program. So I learned this later on and reflecting back on kind of how troubled he seemed and unhappy and all of this. I was like, wow, he was really going through a lot then. And his mom worked at the school. Like it was, I mean, he had to go to those therapies, and clearly it was something that he was struggling with. So that's kind of the foundation of when I started really thinking about these things practically. But I honestly was scared to study the topic out for myself, like go into the Bible and dig into it because I was afraid that I would be faced with like very clear, obvious, like proof that God hates gay people, hates homosexuality, doesn't want them in our community. And then I'd have to figure out, like, match that up with where I was at because I felt based on what I knew of Jesus and my own faith that had grown over the years that did not feel right to me. So I was like, I was afraid almost. It's strange to think back, but that's really where I was at. I kind of just didn't want to know the absolute truth on it. I wanted to just keep loving my students the best way that I knew how. And I was honored that my students were trusting me and would come out to me, knowing that that could jeopardize their place at the school. So my students saw something in me. I never told them that I was affirming. I wasn't even affirming at that point. I didn't know what to think, but they saw something in me and felt safe enough to come to me. And I was desperately looking for some guidance on how to approach these students and how to love them. And I didn't want to study it out per se, but I needed some kind of like practical training in how to love them and how to engage in these conversations if students came to me. And a few years into teaching at this Christian school, I saw a program advertised at my local library, and it was a police officer who was like in kind of a diversity position working with different minorities around the city. And she herself is gay, and she was coming in to speak to teachers about what makes LGBTQ youth especially vulnerable and how, like, just help us understand kind of the higher rates of anxiety and depression and homelessness and incarceration and all of these things. And this is the first time I was really faced with the reality of these statistics and really hearing from someone who grew up knowing that they were gay and now as an adult reflecting back on it and working still with young people. That library seminar that I went to was really impactful. I felt like I was hiding in the corner, thinking like I'm the only Christian school teacher here. These are all public school teachers. And I was like, I hope my school doesn't find out I'm here because they might fire me. Um, so it felt like really like risque that I was even there, but it really did help me because that the speaker, she shared an like a metaphor of what it's like for LGBTQ youth when it comes to adults in their life, whether it be like parents, family members, friends, teachers. And the metaphor was of like being at a beach and seeing a fin going back and forth in the water and how we would assume that that's a shark and we would run away and be afraid and not trust it, but it could actually be a dolphin. And so in her metaphor, she was kind of encouraging us to find ways to let our students know that we are a dolphin. Like we're not gonna like turn them in or turn on them or put them down for their sexuality or gender. And so I came out of that meeting with some resources because some local different organizations had some materials there. And I just came away with this conviction of like, I'm gonna be a dolphin. And so from there, I'm trying to think kind of where there's so many different directions, but this is really the root of why I became interested in understanding this. And it took me years until I finally decided to study out in the Bible and look at different theological perspectives that Christians hold because I'd never met a Christian that held even a side B theology, which we'll get into the sides, but definitely I didn't know anyone who held a side A, a fully affirming Christian theology around homosexuality. But I did start um, looking for those resources, really had a lot of trouble finding resources, finding clarity. I had a few different conversations with people that came into my life where I learned these ideas of side B and side A. I heard that there were these Christian conferences where either like LGBT Christians and their allies or friends and family are coming together at a conference and able to, yeah, have these conversations and study it out and these different things. And I could barely imagine it, but I heard that it was happening. And became definitely very curious what that was about. And I ended up, well, I think the big turning point for me, as probably for many biblical justice oriented folks, was in 2020, where a lot of things
Yeah.
changed in my life, like being at a Christian school when the pandemic hit. All of the racial justice issues came to the forefront, and I observed my school and also the church that I was attending locally. I saw their response to the pandemic, to social justice issues in general, and was really horrified. And so that's when I was teaching remotely from home and I had a lot more time on my hands because I had pre-recorded lessons for my students. I had a lot more time and this news report or article came up about Ahmaud Arbery, who was the black man running in the neighborhood and was shot by these white men in his neighborhood trying to just like patrol the neighborhood, I guess. And there were screenshots and videos of him being shot in the neighborhood streets there. And I saw that that was this news article I came across was like months after this happened. And I saw that none of the people that murdered him were held accountable whatsoever. They were just living their lives. This absolutely just was like the impetus for a domino effect in my life and how like my eyes were open to the experience of being Black in America or being a person of color. And so from there, I just really started seeking out resources to understand the experience of Black people in America, understand the experience of Black people within the Christian church and kind of all the compromises that the church has made in order to just continue all these different systemic racist policies and things. One thing that was really helpful for me was Jamar Tisby's The Color of Compromise, that sort of thing. I created like a little group from my church, from my young adult group, and we started studying out these topics of biblical justice. We used Jamar Tisby's program there to really understand the history of the church and how it's compromised with racism. And I really started speaking out. I was educating myself. I started going to protests. Lots of different things changed for me. And from there, I was still grappling with the theology around homosexuality kind of at the same time. But as I was learning more about the experience of people of color in America and in our Christian communities, I couldn't help but start to draw parallels with the injustices that LGBTQ people were experiencing, have been experiencing in America and in our churches. And I was kind of afraid to bring it up with my little social justice community that I had formed because I thought that I might spook them and they might not feel the same concern and they might just have a very just not affirming viewpoint and not want to study into it the same way that I did. But I had a very encouraging experience because in my um, experience, like going to demonstrations and protests, many of those were led out by a church that I was introduced to. That was the pastor there was leading out a lot of these rallies. And I had seen that that church was opening their doors. It was like the dead of winter, and they were opening their doors to LGBTQ youth specifically that were not able to go to, they were being turned away from other homeless shelters because of their sexuality or gender. And they were specifically opening their doors and asking for blankets and food and clothes and all these things for these queer youth that would be, they knew would be coming. And I basically asked that this is the first time I kind of like asked my social justice community, would you guys like, here's the stats. I shared with them kind of what I had learned about the the vulnerability of these young people and some connections I had to former students. I had a student who was kicked out of the Christian school and several years later was absolutely homeless, living out of their car and called me. So I had already seen like the real repercussions of what could happen when a young person is ostracized in this way and how they could lose everything. So my community right away jumped at the opportunity and just started donating and giving me all these blankets and clothes and food and all this stuff for the shelter. And I filled my car up completely. And at that time, my husband and I had just started foster parenting. And so the first, she was, I think, 12 or 13, our first foster kid. She was only there with us for a couple of weeks, but she had been hurt by the church. She didn't want to be a part of anything to do with Christianity. And she did identify as LGBTQ. And I basically, since she was in our home with us, I asked if she wanted to be a part of this and come help me gather, like look for coats at the store and gather all these supplies that were donated by my friends and take them to the church where this shelter would be. And she was really excited about that. And I got to show her kind of like how the hands and feet of like Jesus really can look when a community comes around to provide and meet the needs of the vulnerable. And in this case, a community that she also identified with. So that was a neat experience. And from there, I went to a LGBT Christian conference myself. So it took a few years, but I finally went to a conference myself. And the majority of attendees and speakers were from the side A perspective. And it was just such an amazing experience. The worship time that we had, I just really felt the presence of God there in like a whole new, like deeper way than I had ever before. And I was just surrounded by people that were either like allies or had, you know, different sexualities and genders and things, but they were all there, like hands raised, praising Jesus, like in the words to the songs when I really was empathizing and listening to people's stories and getting to know them, it just all hit in a totally different way. And from there, I made a connection with actually some Adventist young adults that were LGBTQ. They were actually had already made a lot of connections in this community. And a couple of them even spoke at the conference, but I made these connections, and one of those new friends that I made told me about side Y and side X, basically. So this is where I started like learning like, oh, okay, there's other viewpoints, there's other like what does my church believe? Is my church that I've been attending, is it side Y? Is it side X? Like, and anyways, so I learned about that and I started reading books and studying out the theology for myself. And at that point, I, I didn't want to keep what I was learning to myself. And I was really loving some of the resources that I was finding. So I started making a Google Doc, and this Google Doc eventually became 40 pages long. And I shared it with the friends that I had made at this conference. And one of them, he said, like, wow, like this is wonderful. I'm going to share this with folks. But this would be a lot easier to navigate if it was a website. So he just said that, and the timing worked out where I had already left teaching. I was now foster parenting, and I had been doing um, a freelance curriculum job where I was making math curriculum online. And I had just been let go from that job around this time. And so all of a sudden I had a bunch more time on my hands. I didn't have a job at all for about 6 months there. And so I thought, what the heck? I'm gonna try to make a website. I've never done this before, but I found that the website domain LGBT Christian Resources was available. Like that surprised me. That was like the first one I put in and it was available. So I just ran with it and I worked on the website I worked on the Google Doc for probably 3 months or so, and then I worked on it for another 3 or so months, making that into the initial website. And I officially published the website in June of 2022. So just about 3 years ago at this point. So that's kind of how I got to the point of making the resource. I had in mind my students, my students that had questions, their family members that had questions, and I had in mind my church as well. I wish that my church was more clear about where they stood because my church started bringing in side X ministries to come speak, and I was there for all of their talks. I was sitting in on the Q&A and I asked more questions than anyone in the entire audience. I just had very practical, specific questions based on what I was seeing in my Christian school and the ways that those young people were being hurt by the Christian school and their churches and their Christian families. And so I was asking these questions and not getting satisfactory answers. It felt like they were just evading my questions completely and just going back to like, this homosexuality is evil and it's the world that's creeping into the church and these things. And I was like, no, I know that there are young people that are growing up in the church. Like they're already in the church and the speaker kept talking about how it's like these evil influences creeping in and stuff like that. And anyways, I I made the website because I wanted not only for people to have easier access to resources. I will say back then there was no chat GPT, so I built this website so much from scratch and just Googling and deep diving and going from ministry to ministry, looking at their recommended resources and books and all these things. And so I had nowhere to really look to summarize for me. What is side A, B, Y, X? I literally could not find anywhere that summarized these positions, but I could find little snippets. Like over here, there might be a video of like a debate between side A and side B. And then over here, these different little places and pockets online that I could find information. And so over the past 3 years, I was just trying to create like the main page of my website, which is trying to educate people on the four main views that Christians hold about homosexuality. And so over the years, I have, people have been in touch with me through my website to help me hone in on those definitions. Of course, like no one's gonna fit exactly in, exactly every part of the definition that I've crafted, but I feel good with all of the feedback that I've gotten and all the digging and research that I've done, that this is just a good framework to start discussions and for us to understand other Christians' perspectives. And so, yeah, I'm an educator. I'm a math educator, so this is not my arena, but I've just felt so passionate about it. And I think I have an eye for design, and I really wanted like something simple and approachable, something that people could easily navigate on their phones or on their computer and things like that. So I found myself with the time, the passion, to create this and just continue improving upon it over these past 3 years.
Yeah. And I think it definitely flows that way. The website does. So
Glad to
that
hear
was
it.
successful on your part, and I think being on Squarespace helps. I
Yeah,
wish
Squarespace makes it easy.
that's one
Squarespace
where
does.
they could definitely sponsor the podcast if they wanted to, because I also use Squarespace for biblicaljusticeresources.com. So
Yeah.
that's good. I want to put a pin in a couple things for the listeners. So we're going to probably
Mhm.
come back to the side language and what that means. So
Yeah.
just because it's in some ways some of how you structure the website. So we'll get back to that for the listeners and we'll get back to some other things. But I want to start off with the response in like just remarking on how similar or how parallel it feels like our experiences are in a lot of ways. I
Mhm.
started college as an engineering major, moved into the math department, and then halfway through college was learning about uh, the program I went into was reconciliation studies. So that was the language we used at my school. But
Mhm.
realistically, reconciliation, justice, all of those different things. And I had a similar, like, I don't know that I had a similar sort of like fear about what I was going to find necessarily. Like it kind of sounds like was there for you, but I definitely had a
Mhm.
like, why did we not talk about this in church? Why am I finding out
Yeah.
about this now? And
Mhm.
like a real strong desire to learn more. And at one point, like right at the reason I went to seminary was because I got to a point where I was seeing people outside of the church really concerned about these issues. And I was like, I'm really concerned about these issues, but I don't see people around me in the church talking about them. Is it even possible to be a Christian and care about these things, focus on these things, try to create change with these things? I
Mhm.
think it sounds like we both learned that you can be a Christian and care about these things and talk about these
Yeah.
things. And
Yeah.
my hope, and maybe both of our hopes, is that wherever you stand on issues, there's a way of interacting that is more Christ-like than exclusion.
Mhm. Mhm.
And so I think for a listener who's coming to learn about some of these topics for the first time. That I think is where I would hope would be a starting point for them. And that same sort of curiosity, wanting to continue to learn and not feeling like it is going to be a threat to your religion or religious practice to continue
Mhm.
learning about these things because the
Yeah.
Bible has something to say about a lot of different things that we maybe don't hear about on a weekly basis in church.
Yeah, absolutely.
I'm curious. So you did answer a bunch of the questions I had, but I think I'll probe into a couple of them, a
Yeah,
couple
I
of
can
them
go
here.
deeper into all sorts of different, branches of what I shared. So I tried to just skim the surface. So yeah, what are you curious about?
Yeah, maybe it might actually be helpful to pull the pin out on the side language to just have a brief overview of what that is because it's going to influence some of the future or some of the conversation upcoming. So We mentioned sides A, B, X, and Y. Do you just
Mhm.
have a brief overview of what each of those sides are for people who aren't familiar with the language?
Yeah. The the definitions outlined on my website are definitely not super brief. So in preparation for
Yeah.
the podcast, I was trying to hone in on kind of the briefest explanation of kind of the similarities and differences in these Christian viewpoints, these four positions. And I would point your audience to the it's the Side B podcast. The Side B podcast has one of the co-hosts. His name is Josh Proctor, and it looks like he has created another podcast called Holy Yourselves, WHOLLY, or Holy Ourselves. And so he has put together semi recently because I didn't have it linked on my website because the link was down for quite a while, but I just checked this week and the link is back up. And I think he has the best, most detailed summary of these four sides, including the history behind the terminology and kind of what are the books and the individuals and the ministries that have kind of shaped these different viewpoints. So I would definitely recommend people, I mean, yes, go to my website, but also my website does not get into the history and things like that. So I would recommend going there. And the reason I bring that up too is because he has written like a little short paragraph, like, or a few sentences about each one that I'm gonna try to just skim and share that version of it because it's like the briefest. So side A really comes down to God intentionally created queer people as they are, and therefore God blesses sex between the members of the same sex within certain boundaries, like same-sex marriage, for example. Side B would generally believe that God intended sex to be reserved for a lifelong covenant of marriage between one man and one woman. So side B, side Y, and side X they all hold to the traditional theological beliefs around kind of the definition of marriage and what is acceptable to God when it comes to sexual relations and lifelong commitments. So side B would say that God calls all believers to celibacy within community or a monogamous marriage with a member of the opposite sex. So they really focus in on God expects celibacy of all of us up until the point, or if we are called to then like a monogamous heterosexual sexual marriage. So they focus a lot on not condemning homosexuality as an orientation because they believe that that can be naturally occurring and that God would call people with that same-sex attraction or that gay identity to live a life of celibacy. And so they don't try to erase people's sexual orientation and they do think that maintaining those titles, LGBTQ, does help, can be a healthy way of communicating one's experiences within community and support, especially in like community that encourages and helps side B gay Christians to live a life of celibacy. Side Y, in my estimation, comes down a lot to the identity of a gay Christian. So they would reject this label of gay Christian and they would switch over to this language of I'm a Christian with same-sex attraction rather than I am a gay Christian. And they also emphasize either lifelong abstinence for same-sex attracted individuals or encourage pursuing what we might call a mixed orientation marriage, and that God can still bless that type of marriage even if there's not that initial attraction, even if your primary attraction is to the same sex. And they would be against traditional like conversion therapy, sexual orientation change therapies, but side Y, I have seen generally is very supportive of religious counseling to help manage the feelings of same-sex attraction. So it's a therapy very much based on like the same-sex attracted person voluntarily participating and feeling that God has this calling on their life to either be celibate or to find a opposite sex marriage partner. And so they enter into this type of therapy to receive support from a Christian therapist and how to manage these feelings. Side X, though, is where you're going to find a lot of the ministries where the folks leading out these ministries often refer to themselves as ex-gay, that they have left this lifestyle. So they talk a lot about a gay lifestyle and other harmful behaviors and addictions that they see very much like essential and a basic part of like a gay lifestyle. And they would say that like through a full surrender of your life to God, going through using like Christian discipleship programs and change-oriented type therapies, that God can like basically restore your sexuality to heterosexuality. And so there really is a focus on like God has the power to change you and back to his original design. And so, yeah, that's the side X. So that's the furthest down on the non-affirming spectrum. So side B, side Y, and side X are all within the non-affirming traditional theological biblical interpretation. But a lot of the differences come down to the these questions. Josh Proctor puts these questions in his explanation of the four questions, and he points out that a lot of the differences come down to questions of is can sexual intercourse between two people of the same sex be blessed by God? Is being attracted to the same sex intrinsically moral? Can and should a person with same-sex attractions pursue changing their attractions? Is it morally permissible for Christians with same-sex attractions to identify as LGBTQ plus? And what relationships and family structures are highly valued? So these questions, the four different sides kind of approach these different questions differently. And so that's why where you could get into a lot of the finer details of each of the four perspectives.
Yeah. And I'm familiar with Josh Proctor. He was supposed to come for a training session that we were doing at my day job, but he ended up parting ways with the organization he was with at the time, so didn't end up coming. But I
Oh, okay. Yeah.
have heard of him and know people who know him, I guess,
Hmm.
folks I work with. So with the way the website is set up, your website, and with the the side language, there's like there's the part of me that wants to be like really like concerned about thinking through the theology and all those things. But then there's like the person who is managing a website like this who somewhat selfishly is like that it's so convenient to have side language to be able to split up resources because you can point people to say here are these definitions of where these spots are theologically, these sides, and here like is an immediate like there's a one-to-one connection between what a person believes and sort of the what the resource is trying to convey almost. Whereas
Mhm.
for the for the me making something talking about biblical justice, it is not as cut and dried always. And
Yeah,
so
yeah.
one of the things that I'm curious about with that is as you are adding resources to the list, or as you're thinking about what sorts of resources to share, my assumption is that you have a position and that in some
Mhm.
way you would hope that some people will end up coming to your position. You can correct that if that's true or not.
Yeah.
What does it look
Yeah.
like then to add resources from positions that you don't agree with? What is it? I guess the overall question there is why include things that you wouldn't agree with for people to find?
Yeah. So, yes, my viewpoint has like morphed over the years for sure. And I do identify with one of the sides at this point. And the thing is, there are, obviously, from the links on my website, you can see there are websites that are clearly side A, side B, side X, and you can, those websites, there's many that have been, these ministries have been established for many years. And if people want to know about one particular side, that's what those ministries are for. And I think that's very important, but my website is for a completely different purpose. It is to be able to facilitate conversations with Christians that hold these different perspectives. So when it came to the priorities, I have kind of some notes here for myself. My priorities in making the website, I want to educate visitors on the four sides. I wanted to debunk the myth that Christians holding a more accepting or inclusive theology have no interest in what the Bible actually says on the topic. So my position is a lot, closer on the affirming end of the spectrum. And I would like people to understand, like, take a look at these resources. Like, these are rooted in the Bible and like the strategies you learn in the seminary for how to interpret scripture. Like these same techniques can be used, and you could come to an affirming theology as well. So there's whole books and all these resources out there, and I would like a website where someone can come and find their perspective, their viewpoint represented. So I do like one of the big things for me was having it so that people can go directly to the resource that they agree with and start there and see their beliefs and their church's beliefs reflected and acknowledged. But then also just a few clicks away, be able to see kind of, well, what are the beliefs that are a little bit further down the non-affirming or further towards the affirming perspective, and kind of look at just little shifts like, okay, this is close to what I believe, but here's these minor differences, and kind of dig into and learn. I'm naturally a very curious person, and I want to know about all these other perspectives, and understanding these different perspectives helped me identify eventually what my convictions are and what I believe lines up with God's character. And so I also wanted to have my website that it wasn't only just sorted by the four sides, but also by the media type, because I'm an educator. I'm very in tune with how people learn in different ways. So I read several books on this topic, but not everyone is going to read a book on it. So that's why I put links to podcasts and videos and shorter articles and all these different media types, so that people can, again, have an entry point into learning about the different positions, regardless of how they learn. And I also am trying to make the resources as current as possible. I did at some point have some resources that were like from the late 90s, and I was like, I think there's like better, more up-to-date versions of a lot of these things. So I try to keep it up to date and current. So I know your question really is about, when I have a particular position, like what is my experience in trying to like represent all the different positions? And I want those positions to all be reflected as accurately as possible. It was hard for me to maybe write out the convictions of like, let's say a side X, because I'm quite far from that perspective at this point in my life. And you will see on my website that I put kind of a warning about sexual orientation change type therapies and what we know about the damage that that can um, create. And I do encourage people under my website where the link for taking action. I just really encourage people to listen to the stories and get to know LGBT people, whether they're Christian or not Christian. But I want those voices to be heard. And so I want people to, yeah, be able to, yeah, learn more about those. And so that's why I have the feedback, the contact info page on my website, because I want to receive emails from people correcting my descriptions. And I have made a lot. Every time someone emails me with concerns about how I've described a side, I take that so seriously and I will engage with them. I might get on a Zoom call with them, or we might have long emails back and forth, like of the finer points. I'm never trying to like say like that I understand this better than anyone else. I am just trying to reflect these viewpoints as accurately and objectively as I can. But I do have, yeah, those little notes on especially SciDex resources, because what's you might think that I would have more resources of a certain type that I agree with more, but honestly, it kind of just depends on how much time I've dug into different sides. Like if I've just like, oh, just started digging really deeply into side X, for example, I have more side X resources or organizations specifically. I have more side X organizations linked than even side A, and many more than side B and side Y. So the amount on there that I'm linking doesn't correlate to um, kind of like how truthful it is. It's just how many organizations are out there and how much resources and are being put out on the internet and published in books and things like that.
Yeah. It's bringing to mind, I had someone whose profession is they're a librarian on the podcast about 2 months ago now, and it
Oh, I
feels
heard
very
that
much
one.
like the same sort of work, which I was the reason I had her on, or part of the reason was it just feels
Yeah,
like we're curating we're curating in a similar way that a librarian does. And she even talked about there are ways to, like, there are processes for pulling resources off a shelf if they're not being used or if they're out of date or something like that.
hmm.
And it sounds like you have a similar, like, if
Ah,
something is out of date, we're going to pull it off because there's newer, whether it be better information or more accurate information or whatever. Like, there are things that are
totally.
more helpful for people.
Yeah, and there are blogs out there that have really formed certain sides, and the author of the blog might have stopped posting in like 2019, let's say, but those blog posts are dated, and so I don't mind linking something like that because you can tell this isn't like the most updated information, but this helps you understand the history and how the theology kind of like was formed around a certain side and things like that. So I definitely try to add those things for clarity.
Yeah. And that's the type of thing where seeing the history of how things have developed can also be helpful, even if it is however long in the past. I'm curious with that. So that would be one way where you're pulling resources out of a list. Are there any, whether you actually have, I don't like need a list of things you haven't included, but like, is there a would there be reasons other than date that you haven't included, whether it be a resource or an organization or something in one of the lists? Like, what type of a thing would you look at and say, I'm not going to include this for a certain reason?
Yeah, I I don't really have a list of things I wouldn't include. I wrote some notes for myself about some of the challenges that I have experienced in creating and maintaining the website. So this might relate to your question somewhat. I have had the challenge of some resources are like non-denominational, but other resources are connected to specific denominations because
Yeah.
my denominational affiliation is Seventh-day Adventist. I, of course, wanted to make sure that all of the like prominent resources from the different sides, which within Adventism, you can find resources and perspectives from all four sides. And so I wanted to make sure those were on there. But, I don't need to create like a whole page of just Adventist perspective resources because I think people from all denominations can benefit from what other denominations are saying on these topics. But it's been a challenge to figure out like, okay, what people coming to my website, are they wanting to just go right into like, oh, I'm Catholic. And so like where on this website can I find Catholic resources or things like that? So I have not excluded any resources based on the denomination. I've just had the challenge of figuring out how to label those or identify those and where to place them on my website besides just under the sides. I've also had the challenge of categorizing resources that represent multiple different sides. So that is a lot more rare, but there definitely are some, and I really admire the resources and organizations that do present and give voice to all the different sides, or at least two sides. And that's closer aligned to what I'm trying to do with my website. And so that's been a challenge, but I definitely wanted to put those on my website and they are there. So my website is not only, although it is primarily like specifically like assigned different sides, but there is still that challenge of those organizations that represent multiple. And I also have the challenge of like hyper local organizations. Like if this is an organization that serves, this like St. Louis or something like that. Sometimes I'll be like, wow, this is great. There's so many resources, excellent like explanations and videos and things. But then they're like, they only have meetings in person for people that are in that community and stuff like that. So I have to decide whether like, is this too hyper local for it to be practical to the majority of people that come to my website. And also, there would be, yeah, so there's all the resources when it comes to things beyond just homosexuality. So there's transgender, which really I tried to group resources on that topic under the umbrella of just gender identity because there are so many different ways of identifying with a gender or different genders. So these sides do not generally address theology around gender, although they might speak to it. But the side A, B, Y, and X are really talking about same-sex attraction, and that's what they are addressing. But I did want to and have a place on my website for people to learn about gender identity, intersex, asexuality, and so those other identities. And I also made a place on my website for secular resources, as I saw you have done on your resource website as
Yeah.
well. And the challenge there with gender identity and asexuality and things like that, I have done my best to just group them by, well, whether they're Christian or secular, of course, but then within Christian, just kind of Christian affirming, Christian non-affirming. So if there is an organization that is, let's say, side Y, and they have a bunch of resources on gender identity, then I would just put them in non-affirming Christian, but not really say like, oh, this is side Y, because it's not a one-to-one connection there. So I really have not, like, I don't have this list where I'm like, nope, I won't include this. But I do wish that I had, a team of people that I could
Oh, I know.
collaborate with, right? To be like, what do you think? Should we include this? Should we not include this? I just, at this point, am relying on people reaching out to me through my contact page and recommending resources, like suggesting corrections to my website. And then, yeah, I had earlier on, I had someone contact me and say, like, hey, like, I really wish you had more resources about transgender topics, And so that was kind of a bit of a motivation and impetus for me, like, okay, let me try to dig deeper here and create a more, like, a fuller resource list for those as well.
Yeah. It's so interesting to hear how many of those things like I'm thinking about as well. One of the things with the local aspect is like people who are listening to the podcast regularly will know that I'm talking a lot about Minneapolis because I live in Minneapolis. So
Yes.
the goal then is not just like what is happening here, but how does what is happening here, like what can someone who doesn't live here learn about like just sort of understanding something more broadly based off of what we're seeing in one part of the country. So
Yeah,
that's a thing I run
yeah.
into. I don't know that I've ended up with denominational specific resources yet, but I do know that they exist. Like the
Yeah.
Methodists have the UMC has a initiative. The Covenant Church, I'm a part of a Covenant Church. Covenant Church has their own initiative. Like you could probably go down the line of denominations. So then it again would probably have to be what can we learn? What can we learn that applies to us? And then to some of the things that you've talked about in the past or that you've already talked about today, what how is this helping to refine my understanding of my position, or how is it helping me to change what my position is, kind of fit into what I'm finding to be true or not? So those are all
Mhm.
things that I think of. The secular resource thing is interesting to me too, because there are some things where, for me in particular, with different social issues, there are books that you need to read to understand a topic that are not
Yeah.
Christian. I probably have a bunch of them on the shelves back here. But like there are history books that cover what was happening at the time. The church was involved at the time, but it's not specifically about the church. There are something like The New Jim Crow comes to mind, which is a
Hmm.
very heavy book that I would not recommend as a starting point, but
Right.
like is the key text on mass incarceration at this point. So like
Hmm.
if you want to understand some of these things, you need to read things outside of Christianity.
Yeah.
So I'm
Absolutely.
curious.
Yeah.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I was just gonna say, yeah, the first book that, I read on racial justice issues was like White Fragility, which was a great starting point for me, and that's not from a Christian perspective. But then further on down the line, I was introduced to books like the So You Want to Talk About Race
Yeah,
and Black Fatigue is another one that's just like you can't beat just the like basic groundwork that they lay out. And then, yes, I've read, just as many or more Christian books on the topic. But yeah, it's so valuable to share those really good, like core books that you've
yeah.
mentioned. Yeah.
So unfortunately, we're running out of time here. But
Yeah.
another thing I want to ask, Do you feel like you're drowning in resources to try and add to your lists? Because for me, I feel like justice can be so broad that there are like thousands of books I could add to the list, and I just don't have time to even find them, let alone read them. I'm already at a point where I can't read all the things I put on the list.
Oh yeah.
With as I look at the topics you talk about sort of from the outside, it doesn't seem like there would be a ton of things until you start diving further in and learning more and
Mhm.
realizing, like, even at a top level, there's a difference between sexuality and gender identity. And that can
Yes.
suddenly a thing that looked like it was this big gets twice as big. Do you feel, what
Yeah.
does that look like for you?
So, yeah, as I was discovering more resources, I there was a point where I kind of like had to rethink the design on my website and how I was sorting these things because some of the pages started getting so long that I could feel the website lagging. And I was like, oh no, I can't have this. So I've got to split these up. So, like under side A organizations, I have it split into like youth organizations, denominational organizations, advocacy organizations, interfaith organizations, things like that. So I started really breaking them down and in at least the way that in my mind I'm sorting them. Um, but yeah, it's in the just the past few years, it seems I don't know if I'm imagining it or if I'm just getting like recommended more things, but it seems like exponential growth of resources and more ministries and things that are coming out of the woodwork. I'll like turn my head and all of a sudden like, oh, there's all these books that were now published in 2025 and like I don't have them linked yet and things like that. So it doesn't take too much just like digging and looking around to start yeah, feeling overwhelmed by how many resources. And for quite a while, I'll just be like adding them, adding them, adding them. But that's where it probably would be a good idea to have some collaborators to discuss, okay, I can't just keep adding these resources infinitely. I need a way of deciding, okay, which ones are going to come off my website and phase out and what kind of criteria am I going to use for them to really be put up on my website?
Yeah, I feel that so strongly. That
Yeah,
might end up
yeah.
leading to more conversations offline between us just to
Absolutely. I'd
commiserate
love
on that
to.
front.
Hmm.
Maybe the last question for you for this isn't, I mean, this podcast is not necessarily a one to focus on sexuality and gender, but
Yeah.
I've had you on here and now the episode before you will be Greg Coles, who I don't know if you know the name, but is on the side B side.
Yeah.
We
Yeah,
had
I
some,
do
we had
definitely
a,
recognize that
his
name.
PhD is in English, so we had a conversation about just language in general and how Christians use language, but touched on some of
Great.
that. So, all that to say, aspects of the conversation about sexuality and gender are going to appear on this podcast, even if it doesn't end up being the thrust of what we talk about. For people who
Mhm.
are not familiar and who maybe hold to a side, maybe don't hold to a side, what would you recommend as some sort of starting point resources to say, if you just want to learn about what these sides are saying, what would you recommend to folks?
So I would recommend, yeah, Josh Proctor's explanation of the history of the four different sides for sure as a great starting point. But I also just really want people to like look inward and examine their hearts and some people criticize, let's say, parents of gay children that were non-affirming and then became affirming once their child came out, and they sometimes are criticized for just caving and throwing out the Bible, like just because it's their child, and now they're just going to view it differently. And the thing is, like parents, Christian parents in this situation, if they become affirming, like it's not overnight. They're if you actually look at the stories, there's videos, there's books, there's all start if you haven't sat down with a gay Christian or an LGBTQ young person who's in the throes of like trying to figure this out and decide, am I gonna continue to stay in church or not? Because I'm leaning not, and understanding why, understanding their stories and their experiences, that's really where I would want people to start. So to just get really specific, if you know someone listening right now doesn't have that type of relationship with someone that they interact with and care about, um, you can find all sorts of things online, but I'm going to specifically recommend a a musical artist. He goes by Tim B. Told. Tim B. Told, and he was a worship leader at his Christian church, and he was in the closet until I think around 2017. But he has kind of like a blog on his website and his songs. There are several of his songs that really, really express where a a gay Christian young person is at often in their journey. Like it's just a very common experience that is had. He has this song called Words You Mean. And this is the biggest point I think of my website is I want Christians to accurately describe and institutions and churches and ministries to use words accurately to describe where they're at on the spectrum of affirmation. Tim Be Told song Words You Mean. Um, he's saying, if there is love and mercy for sinners, is there a place for sinners like me? But there's only room for sinners you choose. So please use the words you mean. Don't tell me you love and just hate my sin, then offer a kingdom that won't let me in. You say there's a good God. He's good when you say, you call me his child, then you sent me away. You threw your stones and traded mercy for empty phrases. So, this song and also the song entitled When Someone Loves You, I think just it's a great place to start and understand someone's heart and someone's experience that loves the Lord and has dedicated, you know, their whole youth and young adult life to service of God, but yet they knew this whole time that they didn't belong. And people are saying like, we'll love you no matter what, and you're God's child, but then they discarded him, you know, he wasn't allowed back into his church after he came out. And so just really consider like, hey, I want to accurately represent in my ministry and in my church kind of where we're at. I know it's hard. A lot of churches like don't want to say plainly because they just want to say welcome all, any and all, like we'll love you. But there are if a gay Christian is looking for a church and they become integrated into the community, but then they experience this rejection when they find out, like, oh, they start inviting ex-gay speakers, and like maybe the pastor starts talking on these topics more, and they start realizing it's like to understand that experience, I think is so important. Just this terrible, awful um, tear in someone's life when they become a part of a Christian community and then realize, like, actually, my community is telling me that I'm going to burn in hell forever. Like, this is, as a Seventh-day Adventist, I'm an annihilationist, so I don't believe in an eternally burning hell forever. But that is what was taught at the Christian school I taught at. And my students were tortured by this idea. I'd have students like text me in the middle of the night, like, am I going to hell because of my sexuality? Like, how, yeah, there's just so much inner turmoil. And the church often, you know, gives an impossible choice to people with that are same-sex attracted, that like choose like God or your sexuality. And And one of those, in most cases, like is not a choice. People are not often choose like they're not choosing to be gay. You can choose to be a Christian or not be a Christian, or to be in Christian community or not be in Christian community. So it becomes this impossible choice. And yeah, I really do want people to learn on my website and then use words carefully to express where they're at and try to expand their understanding. And a lot of these secular resources I put down will help you build out the terminology and understand how to speak respectfully to people with different genders and things like this. It just goes such a long way to start these conversations with that basic knowledge. So, that's, yeah, my long-winded way of saying kind of where to start. Listen to Tim B. Told's music and look at his lyrics and really do go, take this website to your church leadership and to your church community and just, yeah, start meeting together and digging and considering all the different viewpoints and how these viewpoints are held sincerely by Bible believing Christians on all four of the sides. So we should be able to come to these conversations with humility and with just radical, like embodied empathy for LGBT people. And for me, that started with the youth. And not everyone maybe works with youth, but if you work with youth, you should be especially engaged. If you're a parent, if you're going to be a foster parent, so, so important to educate yourself.
Yeah. I think my three last points off that before my camera dies here.
Yeah.
One, it makes me think of the reason I asked Greg to come on for the previous
Mhm.
episode is because I have this voice in my head from my Theology 1 professor saying what we say and how we say it matters. And so having to understand why being careful with what we say and being accurate about what we say matters more broadly in the world. Two, building relationship is a necessary part of continuing to learn with people who are different from us. And it's very difficult to continue feeling a certain way about somebody when you actually know them versus when you didn't
Mhm.
actually know someone.
Mhm.
And number three, to your point from the past or from earlier, different people learn different ways, and there are a lot of different places, not just a book or a blog or a video or whatever, to learn more in a different sort of way about each of these topics. So,
Yes.
thank you for all of this. This has been a great conversation. Hopefully, we will, I
Yes.
think, continue stuff in the future, continue talking.
Absolutely. I would love that. Thank you so much for having me. This has been a wonderful opportunity and an answer to prayer because I did feel moved by God to make this website. And I offered up to God. I said, if you give me the opportunity to share or speak on these topics, like I will say yes, even though I'm a math person and I would prefer to be teaching a math lesson right now than talking about complex spiritual topics. So thank you for this opportunity.
Thank you for listening to the Biblical Justice Resources Podcast. This podcast is hosted, produced, and edited by Eric Beck. To learn more about how you can be resourced for the pursuit of biblical justice, visit our website at biblicaljusticeresources.com.